It was one of those Oxford evenings that seemed to have forgotten which season it belonged, to a faint warmth still lingering in the air, but the stones of St. Swithin's already cold to the touch. I had spent the better part of the night at the Sheldonian, half listening to a string quartet whose first violinist had more enthusiasm than accuracy. Afterwards, I lingered too long at the Randolph bar, trying to convince myself that a second whiskey might bring clarity to an evening that hadn't asked for it. It didn't. It rarely does. Driving home through the High, I saw the faint shimmer of light from the chapel window. I noticed it only because the rest of the city had already folded into sleep, all but that single flicker, trembling behind glass, as though a ghost were trying to breathe. I remember thinking some careless verger had left a candle burning after evensong, a small dereliction, hardly criminal, and yet I slowed the car. Even from across the cobbles, I could sense something in that flame that didn't belong to forgetfulness, but to insistence. By morning, of course, the college was sealed off. A woman's body had been found near the choir stalls, laid out neatly, almost reverently, beneath the gaze of the carved angels. A note beside her, a bottle of pills, the kind of tableau that soothes the bureaucracy of police work suicide, orderly and clean. But there was something about the alignment of it that troubled me. People rarely die tidily, and Oxford, least of all, allows it. I walked into the chapel before the socios had finished their photography. The air smelled of old wood, wax, and the faint sweetness of lilies left too long on the altar. The candle I had seen was gone, but a trace of wax still clung to the edge of the choir step. Lewis, dutiful as always, noted the detail in his notebook. I told him to leave it be. There are moments when the living need to listen before they look. Her name was Dr. Clara Pembroke, 32, medieval poetry lecturer, the sort of woman whose mind left people slightly off balance, bright, unyielding, faintly amused by her own solitude. Her students adored her. Her colleagues tolerated her. The dean described her, in the brittle tone reserved for the recently dead, as singularly devoted. Singularly. I made a note of the word. It was too careful. The official version was comfortingly procedural, an academic under pressure, a lonely heart, pills, prayer, a candle's last defiance. But I found myself thinking of that window again, the one I'd passed the night before. The light had not been steady. It had wavered as though disturbed by motion. Someone had been there, and that meant her final moments were witnessed or shared. Lewis asked if I believed in accidents. I told him, occasionally, but never in Oxford. The city had a way of turning even the most private sorrows into rituals. Beneath the spires, people rehearsed their passions in secret and buried their failures in Latin inscriptions. The candle, the chapel, the arrangement of her body all had the shape of confession rather than despair. Outside, the porter stood shivering in his old tweed coat, insisting he'd locked the place himself after evensong. He'd noticed the candle, but thought little of it. He also remembered, with the sudden precision of guilt, hearing faint music, a woman's voice humming through the wood. He couldn't name the hymn. That, too, I noted. People who forget the tune often remember the wrong truth. When the coroner's van left, the light had already changed. Rain began to slide down the stained glass, blurring the saints into watercolor shadows. I stood in the doorway a little longer than was necessary, my coat heavy with the smell of wax and stone. Somewhere in the nave a droplet fell with rhythmic precision, like a metronome counting down something I had yet to understand. It struck me then that Oxford's beauty was a sort of conspiracy. It disguised decay with grace, dressed sin in scholarship, and allowed the guilty to pray beside their own evidence. Clara Pembroke had not died alone. Of that I was certain. The candle had burned too long, the light had flickered too soon, and I had, foolishly, driven past the moment when truth first began to tremble behind the glass. The next morning arrived reluctant and grey, the sort of Oxford dawn that creeps rather than wakes. The drizzle made everything softer, The bells, the bicycles, the footsteps on Broad Street. I stood in the porter's lodge of St. Swithin's, listening to the kettle hiss while the man behind the counter fumbled with sugar packets. There was something almost sacramental about the stillness. Death leaves its own kind of hush, and here it had already settled in the stone. Clara Pembroke's office smelled faintly of chalk and lavender soap. On the desk, a fountain pen, a half-filled teacup, and a small notebook turned face down as though to hide its final thought. Books formed ramparts on both sides: Piers Plowman, the Pearl Poet, the predictable array of saints and sinners. Her handwriting, I noticed, was steady. Suicide letters, in my experience, rarely are. I read the last one in her diary. It wasn't a farewell. It was revision notes on allegorical silence in devotional poetry. A woman planning her next lecture doesn't usually plan her exit. Lewis stood by the window, pretending to understand what he was looking at. He mentioned she lived alone. No family in Oxford. The cleaning lady said she'd been quiet lately. But then again, quiet was her nature. A don who loved silence, the cleaner called her, as though that were a vice. I leafed through the top drawer pencils lined like soldiers, envelopes addressed in a hand not her own. One of them bore the crest of Balliol College, unopened. The name beneath the return address was Mail, which in Oxford often means trouble. I slipped it into my pocket before Lewis could notice. He had the honest discomfort of a man who believes privacy is sacred. I never shared that belief. The window overlooked the chapel courtyard, its flagstones damp, the faint trace of wax still visible near the drain. From here, she might have seen the reflection of the same candle I'd glimpsed the night before. The symmetry of that thought bothered me. People don't light candles to be seen. They light them to remember, or to warn. Lewis found a crossword folded inside one of her books, The Times, half completed. A clue at the center caught my eye. Sound of prayer's end, unspoken, 7. She had written in silence. Correct, but too easy. I wondered whether she had chosen it or inherited it from someone else's mind. Sometimes the answers we claim are not our own. The dean arrived, exhaling sympathy. He spoke in the tones of a man rehearsed in bereavement, long pauses, soft sighs, phrases like deeply regrettable and tragic waste. I asked about her work. He said she was gifted but solitary. I asked about her friends. He said she had admirers, as though that were enough. His eyes drifted once toward the teacup on the desk. A small betrayal, easily missed. I noted it. The dead often leave behind only the discomfort of those who survive them. After he left, I remained a while, tracing the room's quiet geometry, the lines of the shelves, the faint groove in the carpet where her chair had rolled back countless times. I found myself reading her lecture notes, if only to hear her voice between the margins. She had written, in pencil, a single line: all silence conceals its opposite. I closed the notebook then, not from respect, but from something like recognition. She had been on the verge of saying something. Someone had made sure she didn't. Outside, rain began again, that soft, insinuating kind that never announces itself, only appears as damp on one sleeve. I stood beneath the cloister archway and watched a figure cross the quad, umbrella tilted just enough to hide the face. The gait was precise, almost ceremonial. I wondered if Clara had walked that same path hours before she died, if the candle had burned for her, or from her. Lewis caught up with me, asking if I'd found anything. Only questions, I told him. He smiled a brief, apologetic curve of the mouth as though questions were indulgences, not necessities. As we left the college gates, I noticed the chapel bell ringing once, a single, muted tone. Its echo lingered longer than sound should. And I thought of that crossword clue again, the word she'd chosen, the word she'd lived by. Silence, not absence, but echo withheld. It was the kind of afternoon Oxford does best, a reluctant sun pressed between rain clouds, the stone corridors smelling faintly of mildew and incense. Lewis and I walked the cloister toward the chapel, our footsteps echoing where the choir usually filled the air. Inside, the organ pipes rose like a forest of metal, silent now, accusatory. Someone had left the hymn books open to O Salutaris Hostia. I had no appetite for symbolism, but Oxford has a way of arranging coincidences into sermons. The dean greeted us with the careful courtesy of a man who believed politeness might ward off suspicion. His study overlooked the same courtyard, where the porter claimed to have seen a flicker of light. A crucifix hung above his desk, brass polished to piety. He spoke of Clara as a bright, though troubled, scholar. Too devoted, he said, to solitude and work. When I asked when he had last seen her, he hesitated only a heartbeat, but enough. He remembered her attending evensong, staying behind to practice with the choir. It was, he added, her habit. The word struck me as two deliberate habits I had found, with a camouflage of guilt. The choir boys were gathered in the vestry, a cluster of uneasy eyes and restless hands. One of them, a thin lad with hair like wet straw, confessed to seeing a woman's shadow moving across the nave long after the others had gone. He thought it was Clara, but wasn't sure. Shadows in Oxford tend to impersonate the living. He remembered, too, that the candle beside the lectern had burned lower than usual, and that a faint sound, not quite a hymn, drifted between the pillars. He called it humming. I thought of the porter's account of the same quiet music no one could name. Two witnesses who remembered sound but not sense. The photographer arrived next to a young man in corduroy, carrying a camera too large for his confidence. He had been taking publicity shots for the college brochure the night before, he told us. He'd left before evensong ended but had snapped a few frames of the chapel at dusk. He offered to show them on his laptop, its glow trembling on the choir stall like an unholy candle. Most of the images were of the sort the university prized: soft focus, aesthetic obedience. Then came the last one, a blurred exposure, the flame of a candle bent unnaturally to one side. The distortion of motion. Someone had moved within the frame. Lewis asked about timing. The metadata said 9:42 p.m. Clara's body had been discovered at 1005. The photographer swallowed hard, as though the difference might incriminate him. He'd gone straight home, he insisted. He'd simply forgotten to delete the last image. Forgetfulness, in my experience, is rarely simple. While Lewis continued with the questions, I studied the reflection captured in the photograph's corner, a smudge of gold, perhaps from the lectern, perhaps from a sleeve. A human trace disguised by reverence. The candle's angle troubled me. Most wax melts with gravity, but this one seemed pulled by intention. Someone had leaned close, watching, whispering. It was impossible to tell, yet I couldn't dismiss the thought that the light I had seen from my car that night had not been still at all, but interrupted momentarily by another presence. When we left the chapel, the dean followed, offering condolences to no one in particular. His hand brushed my sleeve in a gesture too brief to interpret. Grief or fear, I couldn't say. He looked older in the half-light of the nave, as if the investigation itself had stolen something from him. Outside, the bells began to toll the hour. Lewis muttered that the choir boy's account seemed confused. I told him confusion was the most reliable witness Oxford ever produced. As we crossed the quad, I turned back once. Through the stained glass, the candle's reflection seemed to waver, not extinguished, merely waiting. I remember thinking that the dead often leave behind their own illumination, and that ours, if we were lucky, only flickered long enough to mislead. I've always distrusted tidy desks. They suggest a kind of moral vanity, the illusion of order disguising whatever chaos lingers beneath the surface. Clara Pembroke's flat was an exercise in such deception. Everything was arranged, books alphabetized, pens aligned, a vase of wilting tulips placed equidistant from the edge of the table. And yet, beneath that precision, something trembled. A faint smell of candle wax still lingered, though the curtains were drawn and the matches gone. Lewis was speaking something about the landlord, the rent being paid 6 months in advance. No signs of disturbance. I half listened, running my fingers over the spines of her books. Chaucer, Langland, Herbert, Donne. It was like walking through a graveyard of faith. Then I saw a thin volume bound in worn green leather, half hidden behind a stack of journals. The title, The Light That Lingers, Devotional Fragments of the 14th Century. Inside, a folded sheet of paper, its edges singed slightly, as if once held too close to a flame. The handwriting was hers, neat, deliberate, but what caught me wasn't the script, it was the absence. The poem stopped midway through a stanza. The light that lingers after prayer is not of God, but of despair, and then nothing. A torn edge. The missing verse is gone. I thought of that candle in the chapel, its wax still soft when I'd touched it. A continuation, perhaps, of the same unfinished line. Lewis asked what I'd found. I told him a poem. He said she was a scholar, not a poet. I said the difference was seldom clear in Oxford. I took the sheet to the window. The sunlight, weak as memory, revealed an impression beneath the words another hand had pressed upon the paper once, heavy enough to leave faint indentations. I traced them with the side of a pencil. The letters emerged slowly, R. Marsh. I recalled the woman from the Fellows' dinner, Dr. Evelyn Marsh, Clara's academic rival. Sharp mind, sharper tongue. There had been something brittle in her laughter, as though she'd learned to disguise envy as wit. The note beneath the poem wasn't addressed, but it felt intimate. Almost a confession. A single line written in Latin, half-erased lux perpetua luceat aes. Eternal light shines upon them. Not her, not me, them. The plural felt deliberate and chilling. I wandered through the rest of the flat. On the dresser stood a framed photograph of the college choir, taken at evensong last term. Clara was there, her expression unreadable. 2 people stood behind her, the dean, his eyes half closed in that ecclesiastical serenity peculiar to hypocrites, and Evelyn Marsh, her face turned slightly toward the camera, as though caught mid-thought. I remembered the photographer's blurred image, that flame bending sideways. Perhaps this was what had drawn the candle's attention, not prayer, but performance. Lewis found a bin filled with torn crossword pages. I took one out. The last clue she had circled read, "Remains after illumination. 6. She had written shades, then crossed it out. Beneath, in smaller letters, she'd added embers. A poet's instinct. A detective's, too. Later, back in the car, Lewis asked if I believed she'd been in love. I told him I believed she'd been betrayed. He said by whom? I said perhaps by everyone, including herself. Oxford had a way of teaching self-destruction in elegant forms. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that half-finished poem, its absence heavier than any words could have been. I poured a whiskey, turned off the light, and thought of the Latin inscription again. The plural of them. The mind wanders in such moments. What if the poem wasn't unfinished, but interrupted? What if someone had taken the missing stanza, not out of curiosity, but fear, the kind that forces silence before confession turns to accusation? In the dark, I imagined her hand lowering that candle onto the chapel step, the flame trembling, the wax softening, her own reflection dissolving in the glass. The light that lingers, she'd written, is not of God, but of despair. Perhaps she'd understood her own line too well, or perhaps someone else had ensured she would never complete it. The next morning, I carried the poem to the Bodleian archives. Paper, after all, remembers what people forget. Somewhere between the ink and the silence, I hoped to find what remained not of Clara Pembroke, but of the truth that refused to die quietly. There is a particular cruelty in academic dinners, the way civility disguises hunger and laughter carries the metallic edge of rivalry. That evening at St. Swithin's, the candles along the high table trembled in the draught from the hall's old chimney, their light thinning across the portraits of dead masters who had once feasted on the same wine, the same gossip. I had been invited, no doubt out of protocol rather than fondness, to dine with the fellows in what the dean referred to as a gesture of transparency. Transparency, I've found, usually means concealment viewed from a flattering angle. Lewis fidgeted beside me, uncomfortable among Latin quotations and the soft cruelty of Oxford wit. To his credit, he endured it with the patience of a man who sees no purpose in the theatre, but has been handed a ticket anyway. I, on the other hand, found myself watching faces the way people lift a glass or avoid an eye. The dean presided, urbane as a bishop, while Dr. Evelyn Marsh sat 2 seats away, her posture immaculate, her smile polished and cold. They spoke of Clara Pembroke with the solemnity one reserves for a promising student rather than a colleague. Her death, the dean said, had cast a long shadow over the college. Evelyn added that Clara's brilliance had always been matched by a certain fragility. The pause she inserted before that word was its own kind of accusation. I remarked that fragility was rarely fatal without assistance. The dean's fork froze midway to his mouth. Someone changed the subject to the weather. Between the soup and the fish course, I caught Evelyn's eyes flickering toward the empty chair opposite Clara's habitual place, as Lewis later confirmed. There was something too rehearsed about her indifference, a deliberate refusal to see the absence that everyone else felt. She asked me if I believed in academic rivalry. I told her rivalry was Oxford's oldest religion. She smiled, a thin movement of lips without warmth, and said that Clara had never understood devotion properly. Later, over the port, conversation turned to the college's finances, the restoration of the chapel, and the photographer's images that would soon appear in the prospectus. The dean lamented that one had to think of presentation even in grief. His hand trembled slightly as he poured. I asked whether Clara had attended the dinner last term when the photograph was taken. He said she had not. Evelyn corrected him she had, briefly before leaving early. The correction seemed to cost her effort. I remember a moment when the candle nearest me guttered, its wax dripping like a tiny hourglass. Lewis leaned in, whispering that the verger had found another candle missing from the chapel storeroom, one of the tall beeswax kind. I glanced at the dean. His gaze had drifted to the window, where the reflection of the candles seemed to multiply endlessly against the glass. As the evening wound on, and the decanter made its second and third journeys down the table, words grew softer, laughter slower. Evelyn rose to make a brief toast. She spoke of the college's resilience, of memory, of Clara's contribution to scholarship. Her voice did not waver, yet when she set down her glass, she avoided looking at the dean. A tremor in her hand caught the light not of fear, I thought, but of regret unacknowledged. After the final course, Lewis and I walked out into the quad. The rain had ceased, leaving the stones slick and luminous beneath the lanterns. He asked if I thought they were all lying. I told him not exactly the truth in Oxford, like wine, which was often diluted to taste. From an upper window came a faint sound, a piano playing something unresolved. Perhaps the dean's rooms, perhaps Evelyn's. The notes drifted into the damp air, thin as breath. I paused at the chapel gate, noticing once again the faint trail of wax near the step. Now nearly invisible in the rain. The light from the hall windows trembled across it like a memory that refused to fade. It was there, in that quiet shimmer between music and silence, that I began to sense what the case had always been about, not faith, not scholarship, but longing disguised as intellect. Oxford was full of such disguises, and I had worn a few myself. Morning light in Oxford has an oddly duplicitous quality. It never arrives cleanly, but filtered through mist, through the prism of age, through the doubt that attaches itself to every surface here. I stood in the quadrangle of St. Swithin's and thought how the sun seemed almost ashamed of itself, painting the chapel windows gold as though forgiveness could be borrowed from the day. Lewis was already there, coffee in one hand, his notebook damp from the drizzle. The verger had found something. He said a box of matches, the long wooden kind used for candles, was discovered behind the organ. It was stamped with the name of a photography studio on Banbury Road. That small, convenient alignment fire and image carried an unease that felt too neat to ignore. We walked to the photographer's studio later that morning. The man, pale and nervous, was wiping lenses with the anxious diligence of the guilty. He claimed he had simply borrowed the matches from the chapel, left them behind by accident. His story was plausible, but it carried the faintly polished edges of rehearsal. Lewis, the kind soul that he is, believed him. I did not. On his workbench lay several contact sheets, one of which bore the chapel interior, captured from different angles. The light from the candle in the photograph appeared distorted again, a spectral tilt, like a flame disturbed by breath. I asked when he had taken them. He hesitated. "Between 9 and 10, he said, though he couldn't recall precisely. It was always between him, between times, between truths. I turned to leave and caught sight of something curious on the studio shelf. A fragment of wax, flattened slightly as if pressed beneath a finger. Not enough to convict a man, but sufficient to unsettle an investigator. He saw me looking, and his smile faltered. Outside, Lewis muttered that I was overcomplicating it. Perhaps, he said, the matches had been there for weeks. I told him that nothing decays unnoticed in Oxford. He looked puzzled, but said nothing more. Back at the college, the verger was waiting near the chapel gate. He was apologetic, uncertain of how much to remember. He insisted he had seen two figures through the stained glass that night, one moving, one still. He had assumed it was Clara and the dean. The distinction between assumption and memory is the birthplace of most lies, deliberate or not. The dean, when I later confronted him, looked tired rather than frightened. He said he had gone to the chapel after Compline to collect a forgotten book. He denied seeing Clara. His eyes betrayed him at the mention of the candle. He claimed not to have noticed it, though the candle had burned precisely at the line of sight from his office window. Either blindness or avoidance, both forms of guilt in their way. Lewis brought me a cup of tea, his peace offering for doubting. He mentioned a trivial discovery. The verger's inventory listed the candles as 12-inch, yet the one recovered from the chapel had been shorter by half. I asked him to repeat that. He did. It was the first clear chime of deduction that day. The candle had burned for perhaps 2 hours, no more. Whoever lit it had done so not long before Clara's death. That evening, I walked alone through the college corridors. The air smelled of varnish and dust, the sort of scent that seems to preserve memory more faithfully than people ever do. I found myself in the chapel again, though I told no one I'd gone. The wax stain was still visible on the step, faintly luminous in the dim light. I knelt, ran my hand across the stone. It was cool, indifferent. The organ loomed above me, its pipes reflecting faint traces of light from the street outside. And then I saw it, not light exactly, but its echo. The window glass had been cleaned recently, yet one corner remained smudged, as though touched by someone watching from within. A handprint, faint, blurred by condensation, a gesture of interruption or farewell. I could not tell. As I left, I looked once more at the place where the candle had burned. False light, I thought, not divine, not accidental. Someone had wanted to see or to be seen. perhaps both. In Oxford, truth is never entirely extinguished. It only flickers differently, depending on who is watching. I remember thinking, as the door closed behind me, that the dead leave their clues not in what they illuminate, but in what they choose to leave in shadow. There are certain mornings when Oxford feels like a memory rehearsing itself, the streets half empty, the mist holding its breath. I remember standing beneath the cloisters of Balliol that day, the stones slick with condensation, thinking that the college possessed the kind of calm that only comes from long practice at concealing guilt. The letter had brought me Clara Pembroke's unopened one, the envelope with its neat blue crest and faint scent of tobacco. Lewis had been skeptical when I told him we were visiting. She never opened it, he said, so perhaps it never mattered. I told him unopened things matter most. They are refusals, not oversights. The Dean of Balliol received us with the polished ease of a man accustomed to confession without consequence. His office was a reliquary of order, mahogany shelves, old glass decanters, the inevitable portrait of a benefactor whose virtue had been purchased posthumously. He read the letter in silence when I handed it over, his lips forming each word like a prayer. It was his signature at the bottom, not a coincidence, but a revelation dressed as routine. He said there had been an offer of appointment to a lectureship in medieval studies. To begin in the new term, they had intended to poach her from St. Swithin's. A compliment, he called it, a coup, more likely. Clara had been undecided, he claimed, though her response never came. His tone betrayed something less than truth, the hesitation of a man remembering himself too carefully. Afterwards, Lewis and I walked through the quadrangle. Students hurried past, faces down, indifferent to tragedy that wasn't theirs. Lewis wondered why a letter about work should mean anything now. I asked him to picture a woman standing at her desk, reading an offer that promised escape. Then imagine her leaving it sealed. He frowned, waiting for the rest. There's only one reason, I told him quietly. She had already chosen to stay. We stopped by the chapel, which is smaller, barer than St. Swithin's, its windows clear rather than stained. A young chaplain greeted us, kind-eyed with that particular gentleness Oxford trains into those who expect not to be listened to. He remembered Clara attending evensong here once or twice, sitting near the back, singing softly, almost to herself. He recalled a quarrel, too, overheard outside the south gate, a woman's voice sharp with indignation, a man's lower, defensive. He hadn't seen their faces, only a hand clutching a letter before it was folded away. Later, in the college library, I sat with the file of correspondence. Among the carbon copies lay a second letter from the Dean of Balliol to the Dean of St. Swithin's, the same date as Clara's death, but sent in the morning. It expressed regret that Clara had declined their offer. Declined. I stared at the word until its shape changed. I asked the librarian for the posting log, a dull administrative detail, but bureaucracy often preserves what morality forgets. The outgoing mail had been signed not by the dean, but by his secretary, who, as luck would have it, was on duty that day. A woman in her 50s, steady, precise. She remembered the letter because the dean had asked her to ensure it left before noon. It had been sealed already. When she glanced at the address, she thought it peculiar, the ink faint, as if written in haste. As we left, Lewis remarked that the dean seemed genuinely saddened. I told him remorse often follows efficiency. He didn't understand, or pretended not to. Back at St. Swithin's, I laid the Balliol letter beside Clara's notes. The motto beneath the crest caught my eye again, Lux perpetua luceat eis. The same words Clara had scrawled beneath her unfinished poem. The echo felt deliberate, like a conversation carried across walls. That evening, in my room, I unfolded the letter one last time. I imagined her seeing that crest, that motto, the promise of a new beginning, and then setting it aside unopened, unchosen. In the dimness, I noticed how the paper caught the light, faint ridges where her fingers might have pressed, as if she had touched it not to read, but to remember, or to say goodbye. Oxford, I thought, breeds its tragedies in silent letters that arrive too late, promises that never breathe beyond the seal. The candle on my desk had nearly burned through, and its final light trembled against the glass, unsure whether to fade or to linger. It was raining again, the sort of Oxford rain that doesn't fall so much as cling, a persistent drizzle that seems to have forgotten where it began. I found myself back in Clara Pembroke's rooms, the lamplight catching the dull gold of the framed photograph on her desk. Her handwriting still lingered in the margins of that unfinished poem, each stroke deliberate, each pause revealing a kind of disciplined hesitation. I was searching not for what she had written, but for what she had erased. The clue arrived by accident. Lewis had been cataloguing her notes and mentioned a translation she had been preparing for publication, a devotional text attributed to St. Bernard. I took the pages from him, glancing through the lines. Latin was familiar enough. I'd read Bernard in school, back when faith had still seemed a reasonable subject of study. But here, something was off. A line had been altered into a single word. Where Bernard wrote caritas, meaning charity or divine love, Clara had written claritas, brightness. It might have been an innocent slip, a scholar's fatigue. But then, beneath her correction, faintly penciled and half erased, appeared the letters E.M. Evelyn Marsh. The discovery was small, almost petty, and yet it moved through me with the chill of recognition. Clara had changed the text deliberately, and Evelyn had noticed. The difference between charity and brightness, between mercy and revelation, was not merely semantic. It was theological, and in Oxford, theology still carried the weight of sin. I carried the manuscript to the chapel, the only place where silence could be trusted. The scent of damp hymnals and extinguished wax still lingered. I placed the pages on the lectern and read aloud the altered line, my voice caught by the echoing vaults. The light that lingers after prayer, Clara's own phrase, found its source here, in the distortion of a saint's words. She had rewritten holiness into illumination, devotion into exposure. Perhaps that was what had frightened her, or someone else. Lewis joined me, rain dripping from his coat. He said the dean wanted a word, though his tone suggested reluctance. When I saw the man again, he looked smaller, his authority shrunken by exhaustion. He insisted he had never interfered in Clara's work, though he'd advised against publication. He said her translation bordered on heresy. I told him heresy was merely the truth without permission. He didn't respond, only stared at the candle I'd relit on the step, watching its flame tilt toward him. As we left, Lewis asked what I thought of the translation. I said it wasn't the translation that mattered, but the misquote. Words are mirrors, I told him. Sometimes they reflect what we fear to see. He shook his head, muttering that he never knew what I meant until much later. That night, I sat alone in my flat, the manuscript spread before me. I noticed something else then, a faint indentation on the final page, the ghost of a word once written and erased. I shaded over it with my pencil until the outline appeared Evelyn M. Missing the second E. It wasn't a spelling error. It was a cipher, subtle, deliberate. A name buried inside theology, hidden in the space between the living and the dead. The telephone rang just before midnight. It was Lewis, apologetic for disturbing me. The Balliol secretary had telephoned him and she'd remembered something odd. A visitor had come to collect Clara's reference file 2 days before her death. A woman, educated voice, polite, insistent. She'd signed the register under the name Evelyn Marsh. I thanked him, though the word felt inadequate. When I replaced the receiver, I found myself staring at the candle's reflection in my window pane. Two flames, side by side, the one before me, and the one inverted in the glass. I wondered which was real. Perhaps it was only exhaustion, or whiskey, or the peculiar companionship of loneliness. But in that doubled light, the misquoted saint seemed suddenly to make sense. Clarita's brightness was not divine at all. It was human, fragile, unbearably brief. The sort of light that exposes rather than redeems. I closed the manuscript and let the room fall back into shadow. Outside, the rain persisted, steady as confession. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled the hour, and its echo folded into the night, a sound that, like truth, never fully dies, only lingers long enough to remind us of what we failed to see. It was Lewis who found the photograph again buried beneath a stack of reports on my desk, smudged by a coffee ring and nearly discarded with the rest of the paperwork that accumulates at the end of an investigation one hasn't yet solved. He said he'd kept thinking about the light. Not the candle, but what it reflected. That was what sent me back to the image of the blurred, hesitant thing the photographer had taken on that fatal evening. At first, it looked as if it always had a wavering flame, the faint outline of the lectern, the hollow space of the choir stalls behind. But this time, I noticed something different, the reflection in the brass. It wasn't the candle at all, not quite. A shape leaned toward it, the edge of a sleeve dark as ink. Clerical, perhaps, or merely black wool. In Oxford, both garments carry equal sanctity. I enlarged the photograph, tracing the light with a pencil against the paper. The angles refused to align. The flame bent toward the aisle, not the nave, which meant the source of disturbance had been behind the camera, not in front of it. The photographer, then, had not captured what he saw, only what moved in his absence. Lewis read my silence as weariness. He asked if I'd been wrong about the candle, about its purpose. I told him I was never entirely wrong, only incompletely right. He said that sounded like an excuse. Perhaps it was. We visited the photographer once more, unannounced. His studio smelled of fixer and loneliness. He greeted us with the strained politeness of a man who has rehearsed his alibi too often. When I showed him the photograph, his hand trembled slightly, then steadied. He said it was nothing more than an optical error. I asked if he believed in coincidence. He said he preferred not to think about belief. That was enough. Belief, I've found, is rarely absent and merely suppressed. Back at the college, the dean's secretary was sorting papers in the antechamber. Her quiet efficiency betrayed nothing until I mentioned the photograph. Then, a pause. She said she remembered the dean asking for it that morning, the day Clara died. He wanted to see the final prints before they went to the publisher. He'd remarked, she recalled, on how odd the light had seemed. She had thought nothing of it. I walked the quadrangle alone that evening. The windows were lit like confessionals, each room a small sanctuary of solitude. Through one of them, I saw Evelyn Marsh at her desk, the glow of a lamp framing her in stillness. She looked as though she were waiting for something that would not arrive, or perhaps she was remembering what already had. Later, in the chapel, I placed the photograph on the lectern itself, aligning the image to its origin. The reflection matched perfectly. What hadn't matched was the flame's direction. I knelt an old instinct, neither prayer nor defiance, and saw what Clara must have seen. From this angle, the dean's office window faced the candle. Whoever stood there would have seen the movement, the bending light. A signal, not a mistake. Lewis entered quietly, carrying the day's reports. He asked what I was looking for. I said the truth, but it might no longer be willing to show itself. He said he'd check the dean's alibi again. I told him not to bother. His absence would prove as false as his presence. He didn't understand, but he trusted the tone. He always did. When he'd gone, I stood in the dimness a while longer. The wax residue had almost vanished now, reduced to a pale ring on the stone, a trace of what had burned too brightly, too briefly. I thought of Clara, of her deliberate candle, her unfinished poem, her refusal to open that letter. People often mistake silence for surrender. In truth, it is the most defiant language we possess. As I left, the last of the daylight caught the brass once more, and the reflection blinked at me, not the flame this time, but my own tired face. For a moment, I almost understood why Clara had chosen that place to die, or to be found. In Oxford, light is never honest. It flatters the living and forgives the dead. Confession is a strange ritual. It promises absolution, but more often it's just another form of performance words polished until guilt sounds almost respectable. That evening, the chapel was empty except for the rain's faint percussion on the roof and the steady pulse of the sanctuary lamp. I'd come back not for prayer, but for pattern. The stone remembers more than people do, and silence, if you wait long enough, begins to speak. The choir screen divided the nave like a thought half-spoken. Beyond it, shadows gathered where the light couldn't reach. It was there I found the missing page thin, torn, folded once. The ink had bled slightly, as if it too had tried to escape. Clara's handwriting again, smaller now, more hurried. A fragment from her diary, I realized, though dated with only a month and a day. She wrote of a secret she no longer wished to bear. She wrote of him. The dean's name wasn't mentioned, but his absence in the words was almost louder than presence. She said she had loved a man who prayed for her soul, but not her freedom. A man who said forgiveness was easier than truth. I read it twice, and then a third time, knowing she hadn't written it for me or anyone living. It was her confession, but not her salvation. Lewis arrived a little after 9. He'd been tracing Evelyn Marsh's movements, piecing together her fragile alibi. She'd been seen leaving the college late, alone, her coat soaked through. When confronted, she admitted to meeting Clara that night near the chapel. They'd argued about the letter from Balliol, about the dean, about betrayal in all its ordinary forms. Evelyn had said she left Clara alive. Lewis believed her. I did not. We waited in the chapel's dimness for her to arrive. It was close to midnight when she entered quietly, as though afraid to disturb the ghosts. She didn't ask why we were there. Her eyes went first to the lectern, then to the choir stalls, as if reacquainting herself with the scene she'd tried to forget. I told her we'd found the diary page. She didn't flinch, only said that Clara had always been dramatic. It wasn't an accusation that undid her, it was the candle. Lewis had placed one where the old wax still marked the stone. When I lit it, its flame curved once again toward the screen, pulled by the faint draft from the side chapel. Evelyn watched the light flicker and whispered that it hadn't been meant to happen, that they'd struggled, that the dean would never have survived another scandal, that she'd tried to silence Clara only for a moment, a push, a fall, the sharp sound of her head striking the step. I remember the stillness that followed. Rain against glass. The faint hiss of the candle. Lewis wrote nothing. He only listened, his pencil still between his fingers. Evelyn said she'd gone to the dean, begging him to call the police. He had refused. He'd said the college would crumble under the weight of it. And so together they arranged the scene. The pills, the note, the candle left burning, the neatness of deceit mistaken for peace. She began to cry then, not with remorse, but fatigue. I poured her a small measure from the flask I carried. Though whiskey at confession is hardly canonical. She said she'd loved Clara once in her way, but that love in Oxford was rarely without hierarchy. I didn't answer. The truth had already spent itself. When we left, the dean was waiting in his study, his collar undone, a man bereft of authority. I told him it was over. He asked what would become of Evelyn. I said that depended on whether he wished to share her salvation or her guilt. His silence was its own confession. Later, as dawn began to pale the windows, I stood again in the chapel doorway. The candle still burned faintly, the flame steady now, as though at last permitted to rest. I thought of Clara's line, "The light that lingers after prayer is not of God, but of despair." She had been right, and yet, as the first birds began to stir beyond the cloisters, I wondered if despair wasn't its own kind of faith in something, even if that something was only the persistence of light after everything else had gone dark. There are moments when the end of a case feels less like conclusion and more like fatigue, a dim quiet settling where the questions once lived. That morning, Oxford was still half asleep beneath a low mist, the cobbles slick with rain, the bells reluctant to begin. I walked across the quadrangle of St. Swithin's, my coat heavy, my thoughts heavier still. The chapel door stood ajar. It always did. Inside, the air held the faint scent of wax and lilies, the residue of tragedy mingled with ritual. The choir stalls had been scrubbed, the floor repolished, as if one could erase death by rearranging the furniture of faith. I stood where Clara had fallen, where light and deception had shared their final conversation, and tried to imagine her voice. The silence answered for her, as silence always does. Evelyn Marsh's confession had been written down now, tidy and bureaucratic, its margins annotated by the legal machinery that would soon consume her. The dean had resigned, citing ill health. The college would survive. It always did. Institutions have thicker skin than people. Lewis joined me, punctual as conscience. He said the papers were calling it the chapel candle murder. He seemed embarrassed by the phrase, as though cheap language cheapened the dead. I told him the press needed poetry more than truth. He said he was glad it was over. I said nothing. I'd long stopped believing in endings. He lingered a while before leaving, his footsteps echoing across the nave, fading into the corridor beyond. When he'd gone, I noticed the candle again, a new one now, lit for morning prayers, its flame steadier than the one before. I found myself wondering who had struck the match. Grief, like devotion, requires its gestures. On the lectern, someone had placed Clara's notebook. Perhaps kindness, perhaps carelessness. I opened it to the last written page. There were no revelations left, only fragments of thought, half-lines of poetry, translations of old texts, and one unfinished sentence. The light that lingers is neither mercy nor sin, but memory. I traced the ink with my thumb, the way one touches a scar not to reopen it, but to acknowledge its persistence. That was when I realized what I'd missed before. The handwriting. Clara's script had always leaned to the right, precise and formal. But this line slanted left, as though written by someone imitating her hand. A small deceit, buried among so many larger ones. Evelyn, perhaps. Or the dean. Or someone who wanted the poem to say what it never did. It was not evidence, only echo, and I was too tired for echoes. I closed the notebook and slipped it back into my pocket, its weight barely perceptible, though it felt heavier than any truth I'd ever carried. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky was clearing with that reluctant tenderness peculiar to English mornings, arriving not with authority but apology. The porter, old and courteous, greeted me with the same question he always asked, whether the college could now return to normal. I told him Oxford's version of normal was simply the repetition of regret. He smiled politely, not understanding, and went back to polishing the brass handle of the gate. I walked toward the High, where the scent of coffee and wet newsprint mingled with the faint tang of bus exhaust. Ordinary life reasserting itself indifferent, almost defiant. I should have felt relief, perhaps even pride. Instead, I felt that quiet emptiness that follows revelation, the silence that remains after the answer has cost more than the question was worth. Later, in my flat, I poured a measure of whiskey and sat by the window. The city spread beneath me, its roofs glistening, its spires catching the pale light. Somewhere, a bell began its hourly lament. I thought of Clara, of Evelyn, of the Dean, 3 lives bound by the geometry of desire and guilt, each seeking illumination and finding only its reflection. The candle I'd brought from the chapel sat on my desk, unlit. I told myself I'd keep it as evidence, though I knew it was a kind of memorial. When I finally struck the match, the flame wavered briefly, then steadied small, stubborn, insufficient. I watched it burn until the wick bent inward, surrendering to its own heat. Perhaps that's all we ever do, I thought, burn until the wax of purpose gives way to the light of consequence. In the end, the truth changes nothing. It only lingers, like the faint scent of smoke after the fire is gone.